Hi. So a couple years ago, I did this bowl that's got these spikes on the outside. And I really like this a lot. But the thing I'd like to try is to do some kind of a little bit more of an interesting joint around where the spikes attach to the bowl. So my thought is to take the pattern that I've done on the mallets that I make, so this joint, and put that around the edge on these spikes where they attach. And it'll make it feel a little more like the attachment is thought through, I guess. So I have this other cherry bowl that I turned in 2018. So it should be dry. And what I'd like to do is do the spike project on this bowl. So that should be fun. The first thing to do is to flatten the rim of the bowl so I can mount it on the lathe. I got out my big jaws and I tried cleaning up the bottom, and that didn't work very well. Looking back at the video, I'm surprised at how fast that happens. I got a catch and the bowl came out of the chuck and broke off a piece. I could see there was a big chunk missing out of the bowl, and I looked and I looked and I could not find that piece that had come out. And I knew it had to be here somewhere. It didn't just turn into sawdust. I looked on both sides of the lathe. I looked under what I thought was everything, but I just could not find that piece. What I finally ended up doing was to pull the footage out of the camera and take it onto my work computer and slow the footage down and see if I could find which direction that piece went. So this is slowed down. I want to say this is like 7% speed. Then I slowed it way down frame by frame, and I found the piece coming off. I found the first frame of the piece coming off and then a second frame. And with this, I could tell which direction that piece was going. And it looked like it was going away from me on the lathe, which was good, which meant it must be over on the CNC side of the lathe. Poking around, I finally found it behind some stuff next to the drawers. Looking at the video footage did actually help. Then I was hoping I could glue it back in well enough that it would just disappear. I clamped the piece in place by holding the bowl down so the rim would be flat again. I figured this is the best way to hold the piece in place. I then remounted the piece, but I decided this method just was not going to work. It sticks out too far from the jaws. And I just used this to find the center, which would allow me to put the bowl on the CNC table, and I could clean up the mortise for the chuck on the CNC machine. This method takes a little longer, there's a little more setup, but it does give a very nice round mortise for the chuck to go in. And the more I could get it centered to cut the circle on the CNC, the more bowl I could save for the project. In turning this on the lathe, what I want to do is just clean up the inside and the rim. And I'll leave the outside rough, as I will be carving that away to make the spikes. So I cleaned up the inside, making it round. Then I used the scraper to get it as smooth as I could. It was a little dusty because it's dry. And then I could sand. So I got the inside completely finished before I started on the outside. I can start making the spikes. As the bowl is cherry, I was thinking I'd want a contrasting wood for the spikes. Have a piece of walnut I can use for that. I can cut half of the joint into the end of this piece of walnut. I did 2 spikes at a time, as that's what the width of this piece of wood would let me do. It's 2 inches thick, so 8/4. And I think it was about 4.5 inches wide, so I could get 2 joints or 2 spikes out of each pass. And once I had that cut, I could walk the piece over to the radial arm saw and cut off a length, which will be the spikes. I can clean up the spike blanks on the table saw. This was a little sketchy. I really should have a sled with a little clamp on it to hold the piece, so I don't have to get my fingers so close to the blade. Then I just removed some of the extra material with the disc sander.
Bed goes up. Bed goes up.
Now that the spike blanks are all made, I can mount the bowl onto the vertical table on the CNC, and I can cut the other half to the joint. Done this a few times, so I know it's nice to have a support piece so the object, the bowl, will be at the same height every time. And I put some blocks on each side, kind of to keep it
Bed goes down.
in that location as I rotate it. I guessed where to put the first one, and I was kind of eyeballing it, kind of hoping I'd be about right. Sometimes I'll balance a bit on the curve of the bowl to see if it's vertical and see if it'll stay in place. And hopefully that's the highest spot where I can start the center of this half of the joint. Just like the cut at the end of the walnut, I first flatten a patch and then cut the shape of the joint into the piece. And it seemed to fit. I decided I should remove the mortise at the bottom, as I was going to be cutting into that to make some of the locations for the spikes. Once I'd cut one location, I would rotate the bowl and cut a new location. I'd marked out with a marker about where I wanted them. I tried to make their locations a little bit more random on this bowl, which in the end made it a little harder to carve, as I had some spots where they were fairly close together. But it looked good at this point. I did a test fit to make sure everything was going to work, and it seemed okay. I can glue all of the spikes into the bowl. So I would put glue onto the tenon end of the spike and get that brushed around as best as I could. Then I would tap that spike blank into the bowl. I did do them roughly in pairs. I think some of them I did one at a time and some I did in pairs, and I would clamp them. With my little tapping segment here, it looks like I just tapped them in and they were done. I was actually doing two and then clamping it, letting it sit for 15, 20 minutes, and then doing the next pair. The last bowl like this I had modified my little vise on the work table to be able to hold it on the top of the table. I actually managed to find the pieces I made the last time. I just made a piece on the vise that sticks up above the table surface and a little curved piece to hold the bowl. I clamped a 2x4 to the tabletop for the other side of the clamp. Then I could start carving. I marked where I thought the points on all of the spikes should go. That would help me aim a little bit as I carved. Began to realize pretty quickly was this bowl was going to be different in that I was going to have to carve into the bowl a little bit more. And this would reveal the joint that I was going after, as that joint was below the surface of the bowl. I had made the spikes a little bit longer than the last time on top of carving into the bowl more. So the spikes were considerably longer than the last bowl, which in the end was what was making this harder to carve, as I wasn't able to reach in a lot of places down into the valleys between the spikes. So I got a variety of different carving tools to try and make this work. I clamped the piece up on end to do the edges of the bowl. This worked a little bit better for that. I have some discs that cut and give you chips, and I have this blue disc that's more something that sands, so it makes dust, but it's a little more controllable. I also splurged on a little carving tool that has a little more power than my older version that I have. This worked pretty well. I wish I'd gotten this earlier. And once the carving was done, it was a lot of sanding, which almost seemed impossible when I got started, as there were so many surfaces to do. In the end, it wasn't too bad. It was a few hours of sanding. I used my drill with the sanding pad, and I did some hand sanding with sandpaper wrapped around a dowel. That worked pretty well. And back to power sanding a little bit. Then once I finally had the sanding done, I could put finish on. And I'm using walnut oil. And it went on pretty easily. I kept poking my wrists with the spikes. And I'd feel the tip of the spikes catching on the rubber gloves every once in a while. The one thing I think I might want to try if I do this again is to turn a little bit of the upper rim on the outside of the bowl. Maybe even make a little reveal. Because as I was carving, making that edge look sort of refined or machined was difficult. That's sort of the one part that looks a little sloppy on this. But it actually, the joints worked, and I think it turned out pretty neat. Thanks for watching.